So welcome to Do Good Lives Have to Cost the Earth, System Change, Not Climate Change. As mentioned, I'm Flo Shalom from Network of Wellbeing. So I'm just going to tell you very briefly about Network of Wellbeing. Now for short, Now's vision is of a world where everyone can live a kind of happy and thriving life within the planet's natural limits. And our mission is to really connect, support and empower people and organisations across the UK that are working towards this kind of idea of sustainable well-being for all. And we kind of achieve this mission through events and network building and also different types of community projects. And we're really pleased and proud to be working in partnership with Eden Project Communities on this series of events, Do Good Lives Have to Cost the Earth. This is the third and final event in the series, and like I mentioned, we've got a really amazing panel of speakers. I'm just going to hand over to Tracy from Eden Project Communities to just share a little bit about their work before we introduce the speakers.
Good evening, everybody. It's so nice of you to be here, and I do have huge respect for people who join us on an evening, because I think it's easier to get monthly and maybe not participate. My name's Tracy Robbins. I head up the UK delivery programme for Eden Project down in Cornwall. They have a UK outreach programme which is all about connecting people to each other and the living world. And we have worked with the Network of Wellbeing, I think for over 2 years now, running events that look at well-being, connection, the environment and the world within which we live. So I warmly welcome you all here, and I too am looking forward to hearing from our amazing guest this evening. Thank you, Flo.
Thanks so much, Tracy. So the topic of this evening's event in particular, the whole series has been called Do Good Lives Have to Cost the Earth. This particular event is called System Change, Not Climate Change. So we've kind of, for those of you that have joined other events in this series, we've tried to take people on a little bit of a journey through kind of an individual level engagement with this question and then a community engagement with the question. And this evening, we're really hoping to take a more kind of wider systemic view at this question of do good lives have to cost the earth. So to get us kind of as the audience starting to think about this topic before we hear from the amazing speakers, I'm just going to share a quick poll. So hopefully you'll see that pop up on your screen now. So the question is, what do you think is the biggest systemic change needed in order to tackle climate change? And you can select multiple options. You don't just need to choose one of these options, but the options moving beyond GDP, so measuring our progress with well-being instead of economic growth, more participatory policy making, grassroots communities pushing for change, a Green New Deal, which is something we hear a lot about at the moment, a global carbon tax, a new type of economic system beyond capitalism, or something else completely that's not even mentioned in this list. And I'll just give a few seconds for you guys to choose whichever of those you think would be the most successful systemic change to help us tackle climate change before I close that poll. So just give your responses now, and then I will end the poll and share the results. So hopefully you can see, yeah, really interesting. Obviously, this is just a quick straw poll of a certain type of audience, but really interesting to see moving beyond GDP coming up very strongly there. You'll be pleased, or many of you likely know that Nic Marks of the Happy Planet Index is one of our speakers this evening, so he's going to be talking a lot about that. So I will stop sharing that poll now. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your views. So we've got a panel of 3 speakers. First of all, we're going to hear from Amanda Janu from Wellbeing Economy Alliance. Then we're going to hear from Ali Skeats from Cool Earth, and then we're going to hear from Nic Marks, who's worked on the Happy Planet Index. So I will now introduce our first speaker of this evening, which is Amanda. Amanda's the Knowledge and Policy Lead for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, WEAL for short. And Amanda is an economic policy expert with over a decade of experience working with governments and international development institutions around the world. So really pleased that Amanda could join us this evening, and I'll hand over to you now, Amanda.
Oh, thank you so much, Flo, and really wonderful to see you all. Let me just check. Can you see this? Yes, Perfect. So very thrilled to be able to provide this first sort of presentation around the theme of systems change, not climate change. And what I'd like to do is to speak a little bit about the wellbeing economy movement, how it's really trying to transform our economic system to promote social and ecological well-being, and some of the work that we're up to at We All, in the hopes that you will get involved and support as well. So before we get into any sort of discussion about the wellbeing economy, I think the first thing is always to start with, what is the economy actually, right? And what are the sort of visions or terms that come to our mind when we think about the economy, because often it's not great. Yeah. So a lot of times we think about stock market fluctuations or GDP growth rates. It's all often presented as something that's very abstract that happens out there beyond our control. But one of the things I just want to tell you a little secret is that we are the economy. Yeah, it's just something that we've created ourselves. And so we have the power to change it. And so for myself personally, what I often like to think of the economy as just the way we produce and provide for one another. It's just a means, it's an activity, it's a way by which we improve our quality of life. But one of the challenges is that somewhere along the way, we started to sort of confuse means and ends. And so I've always really liked this quote by Einstein, that perfection of means and confusions of ends seems to characterize our age, because I think there's probably no area where that's clearer than when it comes to the economy, because we have focused so much of our efforts on thinking about the economy as the generator of wealth, as the driver of production, of consumption. And then we've decided that actually those are the kind of measures by which we're going to evaluate our collective well-being, right? And our collective success and progress as a society. And the challenge, of course, is that, we put a lot of effort into promoting economic growth with the belief that that's going to produce well-being. But I have a feeling, looking at the original poll, that it will not come as any surprise to anybody here that we're in a bad way, right? So we are not only experiencing a massive environmental crisis, got a global pandemic happening, the rates of inequality are just so extreme. And then when you add on top of that, just the growing loneliness and anxiety and isolation, start to question what's it all for, and it starts to get really frustrating when you see policymakers prioritizing the economy, GDP growth, or stock market values, and talking about how well we're doing on the basis of those kind of rubrics or arguments, when we so clearly see that the system's not working. But the good news is that we are not alone here in recognizing these issues. Around the world, there is a growing call for change. So over half of the globe now believes that our current economic system, our capitalism, is doing more harm than good, and really eroding our democracies and leading governments to really just prioritize the interests of the few as opposed to the collective interests. And really recently, a very positive survey came out that showed that 74%, right, of people in G20 countries, the supposed winners of this economic system, really want their country's economic priorities to move from focusing on profits and wealth to really prioritizing human and ecological well-being. And so this all is very much sort of the foundation for the wellbeing economy movement, which comes under a lot of different banners, a lot of different names: circular economy, regenerative development, donut economics, post-growth, degrowth, many more. But what they have in common is a recognition that people and planet are not here to serve the economy, and the economy is here to serve us. And so we have the capacity to build an economic system that really works in service of social justice and ecological well-being. And so really the aim of the wellbeing economy movement is to really move from just fixing and healing and redistributing to getting it right in the first place, to try to get the economy to do more of the heavy lifting, so that it is an active, through the way that we're producing and providing for one another, we are generating collective well-being now and for generations to come. And so the well-being vision is really about an economy designed with a different purpose and evaluated on the basis of different metrics. And so first and foremost, right, an economy should be evaluated not by its capacity to generate profits or wealth or GDP growth, but by its capacity to ensure that everybody has enough, right? Has enough to live in comfort and feel secure in that, so that they have the foundations for a happy and flourishing life. And really critically, right, a well-being economy requires us to really transform our notion of value, because right now, water, plants, trees, animals, none of it is supposedly worth anything until it's transformed into the goods you see around you, right? Which is how we have a situation that Amazon can be worth, the most, like the Amazon company can be worth the most of any company in the world, but the Amazon rainforest isn't worth anything until you cut it down, right? And so the idea here is that we really need to produce for one another in a way that actively regenerates our natural environment and respects planetary boundaries. And really critically, we need to move from this sort of cycle of policymakers trying to grow the economy as much as possible, all of us potentially being parts of that system as well, growing the economy so that we can take some of it to fix the damages that are done in the process, to really building a pre-distributive economy, right? So one that ensures a fair distribution of wealth and power at all aspects of our production and provision systems through, cooperatives and alternative forms of production and engagement with one another. And really importantly, and I think this is really huge, I think it's about building an economy that encourages the best as opposed to the worst in us, right? Right now, economics really assumes that we're all competitive and selfish, individualistic, and encourages us to be so, right? But what we need so much more right now is connection. We need our work as storytellers and stewards, caregivers, to be recognized for the value that they bring to society, so that we can provide these gifts to one another in a way that fosters the trust, purpose, and connection that's so desperately needed in the world right now. And last, but definitely not least, I think the major point is that the well-being economy has to be built by us, right? It will be built by us and a reflection of our local context, our history, our resources, our skills, and our visions for the future. And so it requires all hands on deck, participatory policies, and decision-making practices. And so all of that, of course, I'm sure sounds wonderful, right? And so the question is, how do you actually get there? And so this is where the Wellbeing Economy Alliance emerged a few years ago to try to support with this economic systems change. And this is our little tree strategy. And so our belief is that we need to build a power base, right? That can exert enough influence and advocacy to really shift this economic system. And so that requires people from the climate change movement, people who work on inequality reduction or homelessness or mental health, who are working in academia or in policy from all over the world to really come together and recognize that there's more that unites us than divides us in our vision for the future, to work collaboratively towards building that different system. And to sort of feed this power base, we work a lot on knowledge and policy. So that's the area that I work on specifically. And that's really about trying to describe what is a well-being economy and how we get there, and to allow those to feed a new narrative that can move us beyond critique to really envisioning a different system and believing that it can be viable and that we have agency to make those changes. And so we have a global membership of organizations from all over the world, as well as academics. And so we come together both at the global level, but also try to support policy shifts. So one of the big examples of something we've worked on is building the wellbeing economy governments. And so you may be well aware of this already, but it's currently comprised of New Zealand, Iceland, Finland, Scotland, and Wales. And it's a really beautiful new form of multilateralism where these governments are coming together in a genuine interest of sharing knowledge. They've all built alternative metrics to GDP to monitor success, and are trying to share best practice on how they can meaningfully transform not only their economic systems, but their forms of decision-making to get there. And so one of my favorite examples is always from Wales, because Wales not only developed these beautiful new vision for progress based on these 7 well-being goals, but really importantly, founded it in 5 ways of working, right? And so they're really working on transforming their government and the decision-making processes to take a longer term perspective by having, you know, a commissioner, for example, that looks after the well-being of people who haven't even been born yet, to really focus on prevention as opposed to just constantly trying to put out fires and dealing with, you know, short-term crises. And really recognizing that all of this will require collaboration, not only across government, but engagement of citizens, so that all of these transformations are coming from and by us together. And so one of the ways, like that's like a high level kind of shifts we're seeing, but we recognize that this change aren't going to happen just top down. And so we work a lot on building place-based advocacy and hubs, recognizing that multiple stakeholders from business, from the public sector, from the private sector, and from civil society need to come together in places and really advocate for the shifts that make sense for their location, realizing that we need to break out of this one-size-fits-all economic thinking, and really start to build community societies and economies that work for us. And so with this, I'm going to just apologize for a moment because I have to leave right at 1/2 because we're actually having a hubs gathering with New Zealand and California and some others. And so I've got to go around to speak with them at that point, but I'll make sure to share my contact information if you have any other questions. And so I think the major thing I'll say about we all at the end is just that one of my favorite things, at least, especially coming from the development sector, is that we're not trying to micromanage the change, we're just trying to catalyze it. And so every day our members are instigating their own new exciting initiatives. There are spin-offs and, you know, new sort of locuses such as the We All Youth of our young members who have come together and are doing incredible advocacy, especially in the climate change area, recognizing and promoting the need for economic systems change in that space. But more than anything, I think what we do is trying to just remind people that we are the economy, that it is something that has been constructed by us and can be reconstructed with a different vision and different understandings of value and how we want to live together on this planet. And so with that, I'll end for now, but this is my email. I'll also put it in the chat and love to hear if you have any questions now or reach out anytime. And I hope that you'll consider joining. Thanks.
Thank you so much. For that wonderful presentation, Amanda. It's really, really inspiring to hear about We All's work. Like you mentioned, we're going to have a Q&A with all the speakers later on, but Amanda might need to drop out before then. So I'm going to hand over to the Network of Wellbeing Director, Roger Higman, who's going to ask just 1 or 2 questions to Amanda directly following her talk before we hand over to the next speaker. So over to you, Roger.
Thank you, Flo. And yeah, really, really interesting talk, Amanda, and thanks for that. I guess there are 4 questions people have asked, and 3 of them were actually from the same person. So I'm going to ask a couple of them, and maybe we'll take it from there. The first thing is the problem the focus on GDP, or is it more to do with something about capitalism? It's where people always use. Would another economic system, I mean, communism or anything like that, be any better if it aims solely to boost GDP?
Yes. So first of all, let me just say that I think Nic, who's going to speak later, is going to speak a lot about, you know, the importance of alternative indicators and how they can help us to really influence and inform our vision of progress, right? And so I do think there's huge issues with the fact that we've taken an economic indicator like GDP that just tells us about how much we're producing, right, and consuming. That's all it tells you. It doesn't tell you what we're producing, quality of it, like impacts of it, right? And use that and elevated that as our sort of metric of collective success. But with that being said, I will say also in working in this area, a lot of governments now have developed alternative indicators, but that doesn't necessarily translate into different forms of decision making. And I think it's because this is not just an issue of the quantitative indicators that seeped into our culture, right? Like even for ourselves, we often think about our own success on the basis of how much money we make, right? It informs the kind of tools we use to make decisions like cost benefit analysis, you know, it's seeped into a lot of different areas. And so I think it's not just about articulating a different vision of progress, but really internalizing that, and then thinking and being really intentional about how we want to live together on this planet in order to achieve it. So yeah, that's what Tracy said.
Great, that's really helpful. And then the second question, is there a critical mass of the population? You talked about 75% or they're supporting this sort of change. Is there a critical mass of the population and we need to be committed to our goals to get the change needed? And if so, what is it?
So it's interesting, I guess in social movement theory, yeah, it actually says that you need about 10%. Yeah, that's about how much you need of people to be really bought on to a particular issue in order for it to have enough impact, right? Now, it's hard to say who out of that 10%, right? You know what I mean? Because different people have different kind of connections. They have different ways that they're going to be able to articulate and push for these kind of changes in a way that will resonate maybe with larger groups, right? And so I think probably the distribution diversity of that group is really important as well. But that's at least what they say in the social movement, literature and research. But yeah, hopefully, even more. I think we've got more than that already. Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. Okay, I forgot to run for one more, Flo. Annalise says a really interesting one. What's the overlap between a circular economy and a well-being economy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really great question. So, I mean, a lot of the way, first of all, when we always started, they sort of chose the term well-being economy mostly because at the time, new economy was something that was being used a lot, and well-being economy seemed a little bit more descriptive of what we actually wanted the economy to be achieving. And it also, relative to maybe, like happiness or things like this, can feel more collective, although that's really different across cultures as well. But we're meant to trying to be an umbrella, right? To recognize that the ideas and the solutions are out there. There are examples of incredible alternative methods of production and provision and ways of living together that come from indigenous movements, from academic literature, from projects, from, national policy programs. And it's about pulling them together and illustrating that together, they can serve as a new paradigm and new ways in which to work. And so the circular economy is a really important part and aspect and tool, I think, within the well-being economy movement of illustrating that businesses, especially enterprises, but I know also that circular economy is also, can sometimes look at even geographic areas and things like this, of how we can produce things in a different way so that we're significantly reducing waste, right? And actively, hopefully, as well, giving back to the earth as much as we're taking.
Finally, if I've got one more.
Sorry, Roger, I'm going to cut you off. Sorry, because we want to move on to our next speaker, but we will, if Amanda's able to stay for a brief part of the Q&A, then we might have a chance to ask her more. But we do have 2 more speakers this evening, so I'm sorry to have to stop that early, but we will hear from more of your questions. And thank you so much, Amanda. Just a really brief, very practical one. I think Sam asked in the chat if we could share a copy of your slides. So we're going to be sending out a follow-up email, and we'll make sure to include all the links and information about all of the speakers. And Amanda's just said, yes, that's fine to include her slides. So we'll include those as well if she sends through a copy. But now I'm going to introduce say thank you very much to Amanda and introduce our next speaker of this evening, which is Ali Skeets. So Ali works for Cool Earth, which is a climate change charity that works with people living in rainforests to protect their forests. And Ali manages Cool Earth's work in Papua New Guinea, where they've got a local office and they work closely with people in different areas of that country. So yeah, really looking forward to hearing Ali's sharing this evening, and I'll hand over to you now, Ali.
Cool, thank you, Flo, and thanks for having us here. It's really nice to see so many people have joined. Just going to get my screen sharing. Can everyone see the first slide?
Not yet. It's a bit. Oh, here it is. There you go.
Okay, excellent. So yeah, I work for a climate change charity called Cool Earth, and and we are based in Cornwall. We've got offices in Peru and Papua New Guinea. And I wanted to talk a bit tonight about well-being and the climate crisis, and actually the role that money and financial economy has in well-being and the climate crisis. So as a charity, our focus is really on tropical rainforests, and these are a really critical part of the climate change mitigation. I think generally most people know that rainforests store and take in millions of tons of carbon. And this kind of makes them one of the most advanced carbon capturing technologies that we have. And what's great is that we have it right now, and we need it now to cool the earth. We all know that rainforest is being destroyed around the world at a really alarming rate, meaning it can't absorb as much carbon from the atmosphere, and also cutting it down releases more CO2. So if we can prevent forest loss, I think it's kind of a win-win situation. We call it a nature-based solution. It's a cost-effective solution, and also involves people and planetary well-being. One thing that I think all of us I think, sorry, I had a bit of weird background noise. Something that I think we can all forget about forests is that they're not a pristine or untouched wilderness, they're actually an inhabited landscape. And these landscapes are used and shaped by people, like this village in the Peruvian Amazon. And for millennia, the cultures and beliefs and lifestyles of people living there are what's enabled the rainforest to remain such an amazing carbon sink. This year in particular, there's countless reports and scientific studies showing that forests managed by Indigenous people and local communities show less deforestation and hold more carbon than forests managed in other ways. And when I say this, I don't necessarily mean that Indigenous people living there intentionally protect forests. Sometimes they do as their livelihoods, but they're not necessarily framed as conservationists as we might think. But what's really clear is just their lifestyles and their livelihoods protect the forest. So this slide says, I'm probably going to pronounce it really badly, but it says Tahimat Bahut. And this is what the indigenous Awahum people in Peru call well-being. And for the Awahum people, well-being holds a really traditional core value of generosity, autonomy, and social relationships. This also holds true in Papua New Guinea, and I've seen people's really close relationships with the environment and each other. And an example that really sticks with me is when the small fishing boats came in and landed tuna in the village. Everyone gathered around, huge social event as the fish are cut up and shared out. So these communities in Papua New Guinea and the Awahum people in Peru, they do inhabit remote locations, but infrastructure and virtual communication technologies mean really that consumerism is now at their doorstep. I think it's natural and fair that they do want to live in a world with a greater household income, because this can support sort of childhood education, access to healthcare, and limitless opportunities that we all get from a financial money economy. And as the world is becoming more connected, for people living in rainforests, threats are emerging daily, new threats that can destroy their landscape and their homes, but threats which at the same time can provide finance that they need for well-being. So plantation and resource extraction, for example, can pay local people really well. However, although there's a need for cash, a lot of Indigenous peoples are still fighting for their rights to stay on ancestral lands and put well-being, social well-being, and their traditional livelihoods above finance and economies. So we're talking about system change. So I wanted to cover a little bit today about what needs to change and what support we can offer to back local people to meet their well-being and economic needs. And at Cool Earth, we think that cash is actually quite a big part of this solution. And when I joined this, I felt like it doesn't always feel very right to talk about cash and getting money and well-being at the same time. But most models of well-being do require resources. So kind of food, housing, healthcare, warmth, and security, they're the basics of people's needs. So this is a house in Costa village in Papua New Guinea. They needed money to build that. Love and social interactions are also essential for well-being. And these might not necessarily need cash, but sometimes money helps people build a social capital. And by that, I mean it helps them build links and bonds of friendship. So for some of us, this might be buying around at the pub, talking to some new people who might give us useful advice later. And in Papua New Guinea, it might be having the means to contribute a chicken to a village feast and gaining contacts with elders who might later support a claim to land. So talking about cash and well-being, how much cash do we actually need to get well-being? And I don't think there's a universal answer to this, but a lot of you might have heard of universal basic income. So a regular payment given usually by government to everybody in society to create a minimum wealth, a minimum income. And it has been trialled in several countries, including Germany, Finland, the Netherlands, but only trialled on small groups of people, so it's not truly universal. And an interesting fact that I found the other day, and please don't ask me any questions about it because it's only in as a fact, is that the only country to have used universal basic income universally, so giving it to every single person, is Iran, which has been doing it since 2011. And in Iran, they're giving a basic income to every single household as an alternative to subsidizing food and energy. Moving on from universal basic income, at the end of 2020, there was a brilliant paper from researchers at a university in the Netherlands, and they introduced the idea of a conservation basic income. And this took some of the strengths of universal basic income, so giving cash for people to spend on whatever they want, unconditional, and giving enough for people to survive on. But it replaced the universality, the universal giving with just giving it to people living in biodiversity hotspots. And we all know that the people who live in those hotspots are the ones who end up protecting it the best. And Kulas we really strongly believe that the people living in rainforest are the ones who are going to protect it from external threats. And this financial support is a means to give them that support. So our work is not quite a conservation basic income, but we take that idea and we do put the people who live in the rainforest at the forefront of decision making, and we do provide communal cash grants to rainforest villages. We've been doing this since 2008. And when we give that cash, it's so much more than just a cash transfer. It's more than just buying a house or food or chicken at a feast. It's transferring choice and control and leadership to people living in rainforest. And these things can lead to self-fulfillment, autonomy, and the means to decide where your life is going, which is something that we all want. So in rainforest, threats to people's lifestyles and lands, they're constantly changing, and people need to be able to respond to threats. That means they need to hold control and choice. Giving cash really allows them that opportunity to adapt to this sort of more connected world and manage and invest in their own communities. In my work with Cool Earth, I've seen this money being invested in health, small businesses and schools. But what's really nice about giving cash unconditionally is that it can really be used for anything that the village wants in order to counter threats to their development or their lifestyles or their forest lands. And you can kind of imagine how useful that cash was last year in local people's responses in the global pandemic. So going back a little bit to sort of forests and climate change, our work is not about securing this pristine wilderness rainforest, but it's about challenging a system that has tended to exclude Indigenous peoples in the past from decision making, and really bringing about change to back them to continue shaping that forest landscape and shape their livelihoods. So we're hoping, we think you cannot tackle climate change without tackling social and economic and political injustices too. And one of these injustices, I think my cat's about to is that in the past decade, only about 1% of global climate overseas development aid has gone to Indigenous people and local communities. And I think we need to focus much more on getting this cash to Indigenous people, on their well-being, on equity and justice. we all know that forest managed by local people is healthier as a climate solution because they're the only ones able to respond to the dynamic threats to their forests and their well-being. So funding for nature-based solutions really, really needs to go to the people who are best at protecting the natural world. Because that forest, their forest, is intrinsically linked to their livelihoods and actually to all of our global well-being. So I wanted to kind of wrap up, and I think one of those questions in the survey at the beginning about giving power to grassroots communities actually ties in really nicely in the end of this talk and this final slide, because there is such diversity in grassroots communities and Indigenous peoples' worldviews, and their resilience and their views should be embraced and protected and promoted. I think we need a bit of a change whereby we start to trust that the way they see and react to their environment is the best way. And we need to back their choices and their lifestyles where well-being and environment go so closely hand in hand. And really, this is what's going to define the future of Earth and climate solution and global people, all of our well-beings. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ali, for that very inspiring talk. If I can just ask you to stop sharing your screen. Wonderful. So yeah, really, really interesting to hear about your work, and I'm just going to invite Roger to come back in again and share some one or two questions from the audience before we move on to Nic Marks. Oh, you're muted, Roger.
Thanks, Flo. Yeah, a couple of questions again. I guess the first one I was going to ask is Jane Durney asked, how is the level of conservation basic income set? And how does introducing cash into these communities change the dynamics there?
There's several ways in which the level of basic income can be set. Quite a widely recognized way is to use a method called a minimum expenditure basket, which sounds a bit technical, but it kind of adds up what are the minimal costs that people need to meet their basic needs. So the price of food, healthcare, housing, education, what's the very minimum excuse me, amount of money that a family could get by on. That method's been used by a few other NGOs who give cash to communities or to households, and it allows people still to earn on top of that, thereby reducing that risk, maybe that cash giving could prevent employment and prevent people working. So that's one method of setting it as a very basic income. And the second part, changing the dynamics. I mean, it can change dynamics in many, many ways. And there's been a lot of research done by a charity called Give Directly into the risks or the perceived risks of giving cash. So some of those risks included creating conflict within families or between households, risks associated with discouraging people from working, and the risk that everybody always brings up, actually, which is that people will just start drinking too much because they've got too much money. And what Give Directly have found, and actually what we've seen with the communities that we're giving cash to, is none of those risks are realized. Where people are asking for cash in order to shape their livelihoods and shape their forests and their lifestyles and really just meet a kind of minimum, we don't tend to see the negative dynamics. And what we can see is really positive social dynamics coming out of it. So the example I gave of being able in Papua New Guinea to contribute a chicken at a feast, for example, for a single mother in Papua New Guinea might be quite ostracized by society, but being able to buy into that social structure, cash can really do something great to that social dynamic in that case. Yeah.
Got time for another one, Flo?
Maybe because Ali is able to stay with us until for the main Q&A. If there are other questions for Ali, maybe we can draw those into the main Q&A. So if that's okay, Ali, thank you so much. And we are going to move on now to Nic Marks, if I can. So I'm just going to introduce Nic, and yeah, like I say, we'll have a kind of more shared Q&A with all of the speakers. Amanda might need to drop off a little early, but we'll have a Q&A definitely with Nic and Ali at the end. So now on to our third and final speaker of this evening, Nic Marks, who's a policy advisor, speaker, statistician and author, and his work is focused on measuring happiness at the systemic level. And he's really well known for his work on the Happy Planet Index, amongst many other inspiring and transformative projects. And like mentioned earlier, the Happy Planet Index has just relaunched, so it's really exciting to have Nic with us this evening. So I'll hand over to you now, Nic.
Thank you. Can you hear me and see my screen here? Yeah.
Yeah.
Go there, sorry. So I'm going to talk about Happy Planet this week. We did relaunch yesterday with all new data. I'm a statistician, so I'm interested in numbers. So the people that say, what are the alternatives to GDP? That's kind of what my buzz is. Though actually mainly now I work with businesses about how they measure employee experience. That's my day job. So I want to talk about the Happy Planet Index. So and the aim of the Happy Planet Index is really, I don't know if we actually created this thing, but I think Andrew Sims, who I think spoke on your first one, and myself came up with this phrase in a brainstorm, but it might be we've pinched it from somebody else, but it was about 2004. But the good life should not cost the earth. And we kind of thought that was a funny expression. Andrew wrote a book on it. I created an index because he writes and I do stats. So that's kind of the way it goes. But as a statistician, I start thinking, good lives, how do we measure that? Cost the earth, how do we measure that? And so when I wanted to create a new indicator, which ultimately came out of a little project we were doing with WWF at the time about environmental well-being. And I was challenged to come up with some numbers for it. And I came up with what became the Happy Planet Index. And we actually all thought it was too profound to just have as part of this small project. So we then launched a whole body of work around the Happy Planet Index. And basically what I do is I take data on a country's well-being and their life expectancy, and I divide that by their ecological footprint. And when I say a country's well-being, I mean I tend to say how happy, but actually the pure indicator in Happy Planet Index is a little bit less exciting than happiness, in that it's what's called a Cantrell ladder of life, which is where you ask people to rate how good their life is, from the worst possible life to the best possible life. But it's a very good indicator of people's perceived well-being in their country, their experience of life. And then we look at life expectancy, and we basically multiply the two together. And we basically say that it's a quality adjusted life expectancy. So it's the quality of life and the quantity of life. And that's the outcome. And to me, when the person said, what's a well-being economy? I think a well-being economy is an economy which seeks to optimize well-being in the population. It doesn't seek to just produce more stuff. A capitalist economy is basically trying to give us more all the time, GDP more. This is better. This is saying we want better lives. And for me, that's the fundamental difference. So a circular economy could deliver more in a more efficient way. A circular well-being economy will deliver an environmentally efficient, better way of life. And for me, this is actually how I want to deal over the next 5-10 years. If I still have any say in this huge agenda, it's like, let's not worry about adjusting to climate. Our lives can get better. They may be different, but they could be better. So at a pure raw level, that's what the Happy Planet Index does. So we've just launched a website. You can go there, happyplanetindex.org. It's got all sorts of interactive features. We've designed it very much with the idea of getting into economics courses, to getting into schools, A-level courses, to getting into giving people data to play with so that they can actually see what's going on. I'm a great believer that I love stories. I tell stories with numbers. I know that's weird, but that's my job. And so if you can create numbers on those stories, I think it's good. So there's lots of data there that you can go and look at, but I'm going to show you a few graphs. So this is a graph, this is a map of life expectancy globally. So red is bad, green is good, yellow is in between. So the nation with the highest life expectancy is Japan. I think it's 84.5 years. Hong Kong's right there. It might even be slightly higher. I'm not sure if we're allowed to call Hong Kong a nation anymore, but Hong Kong is up there too. The lowest, I'm afraid, we're talking about African countries and Central African Republic. I think that's what they're called. 53 years is their life expectancy. And that's across the whole population. And actually, it's a bit shocking how low Nigeria is because it's so populous, but it's sort of 55 years. So we have a big range from 84, from 55 years in life expectancy. And it's a very good indicator of quality of life expectancy in countries. If we look at the data on experience wellbeing, it's actually pretty similar when you see that across the planet. There's a few countries that start changing, but there's not a massive amount of change there. The areas that are red tend to be red. Of course, you're not going to be enjoying life as much if you've got, your friends and family dying of malaria, HIV, AIDS, conflict. These are not good things to have, yeah? The highest experience wellbeing at the moment is Finland. Scandinavian countries do pretty well. Switzerland does pretty well. Switzerland's very good in life expectancy too. And what we tend to find is that the countries with the highest level of experience well-being are the ones with the strongest social safety nets, i.e. it's the poorest 25% who are less unhappy rather than the whole population being happier. It's basically the bottom of the distribution is pulling down the average across countries, is what tends to be happening. Switzerland's slightly different in that they sort of have a slightly more homogenous population in Switzerland in the sense that they're wealthier and all sorts of things. But that's basically how it goes. So, and the lowest scoring country in our index at the moment is Afghanistan on well-being. This is pre the withdrawal of the US troops and the UK troops, but it's countries that you would expect that are riven with conflicts and things like that. You could then look at the ecological footprint, and of course then you get quite a different view because it's the countries that are richer that have the highest ecological footprint. Actually the very highest ecological footprint is Qatar, and the Middle East states have very high footprints per population. So a lot of air conditioning, a lot of big 4x4s, obviously a lot of oil consumption in those areas. So very, very high footprints in those areas. And of course, the areas with lowest ecological footprint are the poorest nations of the world. And so it's not necessarily good to have a low ecological footprint. It just means mainly that you're poor. There are some countries. So can you see my cursor there? That's Ecuador. Ecuador is just in the green, just in one planet living. There are some countries there that in Latin America, which are not as poor, that are doing a lot better in there. And then what we do is we bring those three together. So we have the outcome. So we're looking at the ultimate outcome, which is good lives, and the fundamental input, and we're dividing the two. And we're saying it's an efficiency indicator, the Happy Planet Index. It's saying how efficient are we in delivering happy and long lives for our citizens. Economics talks a lot about efficiency, and in a way, the planet is our ultimate scarce resource. So how efficient are we, turning our planet into good lives for humans? This is very anthropocentric. I'm not saying that's the only thing. There are all sorts of things. The Happy Planet Index does not include biodiversity, does not include anything about human rights, does not include anything about other things we might be interested in, okay? But it's a very pure indicator in just going, what's our outcome, what's our input in it? So when you bring those all together, you get a Happy Planet Index, which basically, in a way, turns the world order on its head, because what you'll see is that we get a lot of countries in Latin America which are very green, and Europe is starting to go green. I mean, we haven't really colored this exactly, we just swathed it from good to bad, but basically you can see how Latin America goes very green. You can see some countries which are still doing very poorly across the world, but you're basically bringing those indicators together. And when you go to the website, I actually haven't put the rank order exactly here, but what comes top is Costa Rica. Here in Central America, and Costa Rica has higher experience well-being than the USA, live longer than the USA, and use about a quarter of the resources of the USA to get there. So we're basically, again, using the efficiency indicator. Of the top 10 countries, I think 8 of them are from Latin America. Second in the index, and I'm not even sure if this is a smudge on my thing, but just over here is Vanuatu. Vanuatu, which comes second in the index. It is actually representative really of all the Pacific Islands. It's the only Pacific Islands that we've got good data on, so it's the only one in the index. It does really well because it's a small community. So we have a lot of social connectedness, so well-being is high. And also being an island, it tends to have higher barriers to trade. So that means its ecological footprint is smaller because it has more locally produced goods. Their life expectancy is still challenging. It's about 71 years, but it's not 54 like some places in Africa. You know, it's 10 years behind Japan here, but it's not terrible. And then we see countries that are starting to do better. So New Zealand, I think, come 12th in the index down here. And a surprising entry at 14th is the UK, which is kind of surprising to us, but it's because we have decarbonized, we have lowered the amount of carbon in the economy quite a lot in the UK over the last 10 years. We actually have slightly falling life expectancy and we have stable experience well-being. So I'm not trying to say the UK is a poster child for well-being economy, but it is moving in the right direction with its carbonization. Obviously, massively further to go, but that's how the index works. So, you know, some of the highlights is that there's no country that delivers high levels of happy life years with low ecological footprint. The closest is probably Ecuador, in that it has pretty good levels of life expectancy, pretty good levels of happiness and low footprint. Costa Rica tops the whole index. Its ecological footprint is increasing, but Costa Rica has some remarkable things about it, like no army. It has, and in Latin America, the army really is the police force with guns, in the sense that the army tends to be as much about internal stresses as external ones. Very high levels of literacy, pretty high levels of gender equality. It's pretty good, Costa Rica, really, in lots of ways. And considering it's in a very difficult geopolitical region, there are actually lots of historical reasons for why Costa Rica does better. The US has tended to protect Costa Rica for a long time because it's been an important trade route, but they also do remarkable things like a reforesting, things like that. Only 27% of countries at the moment consume with environmental limits. I think it's about 30% of the population. It's pretty close to that. So that's troublesome. And that's even before we start thinking about the stock of carbon in the atmosphere. It's about additions, really. We've added time trends for the first time, and this is basically showing different countries. So this is the UK, the green graph here, which is rising, as I said. And this country here, this green one, is India, which is falling massively for all the wrong reasons. Slightly rising footprint, but a very falling experience well-being in India. There seems to be a lot more tension there than there was, let's put it that way. This is looking at different continents, Latin America, which has traditionally done really well. And actually in here, we've added 2020 data where we have it. There is some 2020 data on the Happy Planet Index website at the moment. And basically Latin America has really struggled with COVID, so it's fallen. Europe has slightly risen, which is kind of unexpected, but that's driven mainly by a falling ecological footprint, about 10% fall. And some countries in Europe at the point of surveying, which we could get into, which is done in 2-week periods and at different times of the year, some were experiencing actually higher levels of well-being during the pandemic because people were very focused on family and loved ones and less stressed apart from getting COVID. The UK is not one of those countries. We had slightly falling well-being, but there are several that did. Life expectancy has dropped by about a year across most countries over that time. You can also see Africa rising, which is driven by rising life expectancy across the continent predominantly. Couple of other countries that's showing Brazil falling, which is Brazil's had a really difficult time. There's lots and lots of data, and really, you know, I haven't got much time to go into it now, but the key takeaways from Happy Planet is that there's definite evidence that good lives don't need to cost the earth. We definitely got some countries which are definitely showing that. We definitely have populations within countries that are definitely living good lives that don't cost the earth. So, you know, there's all sorts of optimism to be had there. We are becoming more efficient at delivering good lives. we need to go a lot quicker. There's no defense of anything. It's just saying that the data is saying we are moving in the right direction. And this is a sort of wheel statement, but I kind of like it, which is that as we built the system, it could be designed differently. I remember someone saying that if something has a beginning in human history, it can have an end, and definitely the economic system has a beginning. Not all bartering, not all trade has always been around, but the way that we created our economic system has a beginning, so it can definitely have an end, or certainly change into something else. So there are things that you can do. The Happy Planet Index is there. You can go and look at it. If you want to do something which is very interactive, I've designed a little sort of cosmopolitan quiz about happiness, health, behaviors, and environmental behaviors, and it's the website to get to that. Well, the shortcut is to go happyplanetindex.me. It's 15 questions. It gives you a report on your own happiness, clues about how to be happier, clues about how to be healthier, and clues to improve your ecological footprint. And included with that is one question on like how you use your power. I think that power is really, really important in the system. So how do you vote? How do you, where do you invest your money? You know, do you campaign on things? Because we not only need to think, you know, yes, we all need to think about reducing our carbon, but we're in a very complex system and we need to push for system change. And I think we are hopefully reaching critical mass with that. So this is our ultimate statement. Let's create a world we all want, where good lives don't cost the earth. Down here, if you want me, that's a email from me, Nic@nicmarks.org. I've got a website, nicmarks.org, if you want to look at it. And yeah, that's it. That's the Happy Planet Index.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Nic. It's really, really inspiring, actually, that, and also just to kind of get that personal insight into you and Andrew having that chat over the kitchen table about do good lives have to cost the earth. And Andrew Sims, like you mentioned, was on the opening event of this series, and now it seems fitting that you've been the kind of final speaker. So now we're going to have a kind of Q&A panel. I think we're going to unfortunately have to say goodbye to Amanda. I'm not sure whether you're able to stay for a brief question, but it looks like it's past on the dot. So thank you so much for joining, Amanda. And we'll have a panel discussion with Nic and Ali. And Roger, I'm going to hand over to you to ask the questions.
Hi, thank you, Flo. That's really great. I guess before maybe we should start, because we haven't had any to Nic at all yet. We'll ask a couple to Nic, and then I'll maybe go back and ask a couple to Ali. Nic, Teresa asked, did you take the CO2 emissions of imports into the UK into account in your calculations, or is it just the stuff we produce at home?
It is ecological footprint is supposed to be a consumer-based, consumption-based indicator, so it should deal with that. I'm not convinced it does perfectly. It's the best measure we have, but we also see some distortions, like you'll see Scandinavian countries have higher ecological footprints because they use more forest products, even though they have local forests. And so there are some issues where ecological footprint is the best global measure we have, but I think statistically, like all of the indicators, it could be improved, but it does do that.
Fantastic. And Maria asked, it was amazing info, she says, how do you actually collect data about well-being?
So we use what's published in the World Happiness Report, which was published this March. It's based on Gallup data. So Gallup started to do a world poll in about 2007, and they basically had the idea that they wanted to measure the well-being of the globe, and they've continued to do that. I don't know what their economic case for it is. They used to give me data, they no longer do, but they give it to World Happiness Report, so we get it from there. It wouldn't be my first choice of well-being question, but we have the same question asked in every country in the world, which is gold dust in that sense for comparing things.
And what is the question? Do you know?
So it's called the Cantrell Ladder of Life, where you ask people on a scale of 0, the worst possible life, and 10, the best possible life, and where do you place yourself in the ladder? And my issue with it is that the vertical scale makes people slightly more materialistic in how they answer that question. when you use a question with a horizontal scale, I know this is really geeky, sorry, but when you use with a horizontal scale, people tend to think more relationally. And so I don't particularly like this because it's more correlated to GDP per capita and slightly lower. It's still related to social connectedness, but slightly lower. So my preference would be to use a question which was asking you, if you think about your life nowadays, how happy are you? You get slightly different data, but not massively.
Okay, fantastic. Moving on to Ali, Tracy asks, how do you share the learning and knowledge and experience from the people of Papua New Guinea and the other places you're working, and share that with the wider world? Are there things that we can learn from the way they behave about our own well-being?
Oh gosh, that's a huge question. So as an organisation, we try and share what we've learned from our work in different countries to inform the decisions we make in other countries. So we've found, for example, that giving cash to a group of leaders or a committee in Peru resulted in community assets and infrastructure, kind of communal goods being bought. And we found the same lessons kind of map across to Papua New Guinea. In terms of sharing to the wider world and what we can learn from people, I think the things that have struck me about being in Papua New Guinea and the things that I've read and heard from my colleagues working in Peru is the kind of social interactions and the closeness of these communities, to their neighbours, as well as to their environment, is something that I think we lack a little bit in Britain. And that social cohesiveness is the thing that kind of drives the protection of their lifestyles and of their forest. And learning from that kind of, I think, could drive more sort of effective campaigning in Britain. When people come together, they campaign much better for change. And this community social structure does a fairly similar thing, I would say, in forest communities. And I think that's a nice lesson of, get to know the people around you, the social cohesiveness and the land.
Brilliant, thank you.
Roger, can I just build on that? Because social cohesion is such a massive well-being indicator, and social connectedness. We are hugely social creatures, and if COVID taught us anything, it's that we miss people massively when we're not allowed to see them, and that is the whole well-being experience. So it's a massive predictor of life expectancy and happiness is social relationships.
And Lavender was asking questions about this because she was pointing out that some countries with high life expectancy have lots of older people, including the United Kingdom, who are extremely unhappy and often unwell, while some African countries have great social connections, as we said, but this doesn't necessarily show up in the measure of well-being. Is there a reason for this? And is life expectancy the best measure of well-being, or could we look at things like QALYs, or could we, are there other questions that we could ask that would change the distribution of what happiness looks like around the world?
So that's why we quality adjust life expectancy, because we do it with happiness rather than quality adjusted tend to be about disease and things like that, or healthy life expectancy. So I do think it needs adjusting. I mean, like you see Japan, 84.5 years, but not the happiest country in the world. I don't think that's particularly about its aging population, but it's around it. And so just statistically, if people are having miserable last 5-10 years of life, which is what people I think worry about with the indicator, it's like, is it going to be just promoting longer lives which haven't got dignity or things like that? That should come out in the happiness data because we're surveying the same people. So if we have good representative samples of all age groups, that should come out in it. But of course, at a personal level, we think there's a trade-off between life expectancy and happiness. There isn't very much. Happy people live about 10 years longer than unhappy people. So actually the unhappy tend to die earlier. I mean, this is really crude, but it's statistically true. So actually, with aging populations tend to have older people who've led happier lives because they've tended to have those social connectedness about it. I mean, that's at a very gross global level. You can always find personal differences.
Okay, and do feel free, incidentally, anybody who wants to ask a question to put it in the chat box, and we'll try and get it asked. But the one of the questions that was really sort of interesting me about all of this is there seems to be a huge sort of discrepancy between maybe developed countries that are over consuming and southern and not producing but still producing well-being, whereas sort of southern countries are under-consuming and not being able to produce well-being. And I'm wondering sort of how do we get away from GDP without challenging the role that consumption plays for individuals in Western society and the developed world? And is it possible to move away from GDP without sort of saying, look, we should all be poorer to some extent?
I think if we talk about well-being, then we can be happier. And the well-being goods are not the material goods. They're relational. And predominantly relational. So, I mean, even when people talk about flying for holidays, they're normally doing it with family, with friends. They are looking for relational experiences. So we need to create relational experiences that are low carbon, low impact. So I don't think they are at the moment condensed, but I don't think they need to be. And actually, Latin America is a great example. You know, Latin America has much lower levels of GDP, but really pretty good levels of well-being because they're so vibrant and they're so social. I mean, the social participation in Latin America is off the scale. You know, if you compare them to Central Eastern Europe, so the former communist countries, Soviet countries, similar levels of GDP per capita, similar levels of life expectancy, really quite different levels of experience well-being. And that is about the social thing. So there's definite evidence that we don't need to consume much to be happy. It's clearly we've got to make a strong case to the whole population about that, because people think that's the way they do it, but it's not statistically true.
Cool. And in terms of the developed world, and the UK in particular, I mean, it sounds like you're talking about two big goals, which is providing a social safety net for the poorest 25% and reducing our overall environmental footprint. Does it come down as simply as that, or is the picture more complicated, do you think?
It's not a bad summary. I mean, I think it is more complicated than that, because there's the whole structure of the economy, the way that interest rates work, that debt works, about dependent on growth. There's some really quite thorny issues in that, and really you should get someone like Tim Jackson to come and talk to you about those things. But you know, the movement to a well-being economy certainly will need something like social safety net, universal income, like that, absolutely for sure. And we need to tax the monkeys out of carbon and all sorts of other things. I mean, just like we've tackled smoking. If you think about it, we tackled smoking by taxation and by making it really unsexy to smoke, and that smoke was disgusting. Obesity, we haven't even touched the thing of, because we just made it personal choice. We're going to have systemic changes in order to move to a low carbon wellbeing economy. And I think that there's only so much we can do as individuals of individual choice. We will have to do it with sticks and carrots through the economic system, I'm going to say, but you know, through governmental systems. I don't see any other way than doing some things which are quite drastic. I do think we've just about starting to get the appetite for this, though. But we do have to have this message. It can be better. It can be better. I mean, if we can stay home and we can sing, we can dance, we can drink, we can love, we can be loved. These are the things that we need to do. They don't need to cost the earth.
Fantastic. Okay, brilliant. I've got a question from Sam for Ali. It's about universal basic income, which you just mentioned, Nick. One of the concerns about UBI is it could lead to rises in consumption levels that would further outstrip the planet's capacity. Has anyone done any research into how UBI could done with protection against that risk?
Okay, it's a good question. I'll be honest, I'm not really probably the best person to answer. I'm sure that research has been done to show that UBI could be done without exacerbating kind of excessive consumption. I would say one of the things about the universal basic income is it really is just a basic income. So I don't know any evidence base for this, but I would judge that that's not really going to encourage excessive consumption where people have basic kind of livelihood needs to meet. So it might not be a risk there. One of the bigger risks I've heard about universal basic income is actually that kind of framing everything as market-based can have a negative impact on the services. So I know I'm not going to quote anything here, but it's something really interesting to start reading about might be the universal basic services theory. So making sure that even when people have plenty of income, plenty of money, that services are still available to people, such as education, healthcare, and those things don't collapse under a basic income sort of strategy. I probably haven't answered your question. I'm very sorry.
I think that was great. We also got a really, from our point of view, a really interesting question for David Green, and David Green always asks the interesting questions. He points out that Bhutan has been using gross national happiness for some time now. How do they fare in the Happy Planet Index, and how much difference has this focus made to their lives? Can we see that their focus has actually delivered better lives yet? Nic?
So regrettably, Bhutan does really poorly on the Happy Planet Index. I've been to Bhutan about 4 or 5 times. I used to advise them on how to measure G&H. I'd like to say I advised them, they didn't really take my advice. So they've got too complicated an indicator for G&H, in my opinion. And I don't think it's very policy focused, but if you were living in that geopolitical region, you'd really want to be in Bhutan. It's a much nicer place to live than Nepal or the separatist states around India. You've got Chinese occupied Tibet to the north. It's a very difficult region. They're a very small country. They're about 650,000 people. Their footprint has gone through the roof over the last 10 years. The carbon consumption has increased massively. I'm not quite sure why. I think they are motorizing their economy quite a lot. You know, it's dirt roads, it's difficult things. They've been building roads there. They also build a lot of hydro, which they sell to India. I'm not quite sure how the accounting for ecological footprint is going there, because it's higher than I would expect, but they do really poorly, I'm afraid. They also are not as happy as they'd like you to say. As in every developing country I've ever looked at, rural women really struggle in any of the accounts. A lot of people live 5-6 miles walk from a road in Bhutan. It's not an easy area to deliver healthcare, to deliver maternity services, all sorts of things. It's a pretty amazing country, but they don't do so brilliantly, sorry.
Well, Flo, how much more time have we got for questions?
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. We were going to move towards, because we want to share some really exciting things we've got coming up following this event series with you all. So maybe we'll move towards wrapping up with our wonderful speakers. So just a kind of final question for Nic and Ali, which is more just a broad question about, you know, any reflections you'd share on this question: do good lives have to cost the earth? Obviously, Nic, you've shared, weave that into your presentation, but maybe we can go to Ali. Any reflections you've got on that overarching question, and then close with Nic before we share what's coming up with the audience.
Sure. I would say that what we've seen from Working Poor Earth for Indigenous peoples and local communities, good lives do not have to cost the earth. And for us, just to trust in those people's ability to manage what is there for us and their resource actually means that the earth, I don't know what I'm trying to say, their lives do not cost the earth, and ours have no need to either. There's a lot to learn there, and placing trust in those people is really vital for planetary health.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ali. That's really, really helpful and valuable. And Nic?
No, I mean, as in, you can see clusters of population where good lives don't cost the earth, and you can create indicators of movement towards that. And I don't think it's an underestimate to say that the fate of humanity depends on us actually answering this question and actually resolving it, because, you know, I don't see how we can continue more than a few hundred years on this planet as a species if we don't sort this out. So somewhere along the line.
Well, at this point, I'm reminded of that quote that Andrew Sims gave us when he did his talk, Nic, which was, "It's the biggest question in the world to which the answer is no, or it's the biggest question in the world to which the answer is yes, in which case we've got a big problem," which hopefully it is now.
Yeah, indeed. So that's exactly the point that we've hopefully been trying to make throughout this series, that, yeah, it's a question that needs to be answered with no. So thank you, Ali and Nic, for joining.
Can I just say one more thing? Is that the reason why some people in the chat are putting it that they're like a country is that the Happy Planet Index Me quiz compares you to a country. So it says you've got the same challenge as this country, i.e. maintain your happiness, reduce your footprint, or whatever it is. And it's a social media hook, but if you've seen it in there, that's what's going on with it. So yeah.
Cool.
That's
It's good
helpful to
fun,
know.
good fun.
Yeah, that's really nice. Like you're like, I'm going for Costa Rica.
I got Costa Rica to my surprise. I thought, but someone put in there that they got Ecuador, which is actually the one that comes up the highest. So that you get like a razzmatazz if you get Ecuador.
Oh, look at them. I got Armenia, so I need to work on something.
Well, Armenia does much better than you'd expect it to. It's kind of one of the surprising countries. I don't really know anything about Armenia, but it does quite well. Yeah.
Wonderful. So I've just, I want to bring Tracy and Pri into the discussion because Tracy from Eden Project Communities is going to share a little bit about what's coming up to kind of follow this series of events. So I'll hand over to you now, Tracy.
Thank you. I thought Pri was going to do it all, so I'm good. I'm glad I know what I'm doing. So yes, so following this series of 3, we always like an opportunity for people to connect with each other and have a talk and a chance to make those connections and relationships and networks we've just been talking about, because we genuinely believe that we are much stronger together than we are apart, and we believe in community and collective action. So we will be holding a networking session, so Together for Our Planet, a networking event, and inviting anybody and everybody who's interested in coming together to our planet to come and meet, to connect, and to find out a bit more about a few other people. And thankfully Hawkwood will be helping me facilitate that along with Now, or I'd be quite lost because there'll be lots of clever people there and passionate people. But that will be part of our Festival of Discovery, which will be on the 12th of November. So there's a link in there, and we'd warmly invite you all to come join us, and let's continue the conversation. Or if you know others that might be interested in that, that would be really excellent to join. What we are going to do is edit some of our speakers, save all the best bits, and show a bit of a pre-record of what's been going on before that actual networking event, just for those who didn't make it. So yes, I'd love to see you all there. And I think it'll be really nice to continue the conversation. Thank you, Flo.
Yeah, thank you, Tracy. Like Tracy says, we're really excited about having that more chance to speak with each other, because we've brought in different speakers and different perspectives throughout this series, and we're really aware of the wealth of experience and different projects and engagements in the audience, and so we really want to have that opportunity to talk to each other. So that's what that event is going to be about, and we're really excited to work in partnership with Hawkwood Centre for Future Thinking to bring them in as partners on that networking event, because they're also doing some really exciting work around building community around climate. So I'm going to hand over to Pri to share a little bit about that.
Thank you, Flo. So yeah, it's really exciting actually. So we've been cooking up a little project in which we're going to bring together this community together with our Climate Action Lab community, which is a conference, an online conference happening next week. It's going to be a mix of different talks and workshops and storytelling and arts, and ultimately we're trying to guide participants into committing to a 10-point climate action plan. And actually we're partnering with Now, and you're coming over to run a networking session during the Climate Action Lab too. And I think it's about, we will be exploring well-being and climate action together with Forgotten. And then following from that, afterwards in the Festival of Discovery, we're bringing our communities together, which is really, as Tracy and Flo have said, is on our will is for our communities and the people and each other to find and to motivate each other. You know, after these events, we are often left with the question, what next? You know, left brimming full of ideas and really inspired. And so many magical things can happen with this cross-pollination. So these are going to be some things to look forward. I think the networking event from Flo and Roger will be on the 3rd of November, the final day of the conference. And the link is there. But yeah, hope to see some of you there. Thank you, Flo. Such a wonderful event.
Thank you so much, Pri and Tracy. And yeah, so we just wanted to give this short space. We're aware tonight we didn't have any kind of breakout rooms and discussions, but it's been amazing to see all of your questions and ideas shared in the chat box. And yeah, and coming up, we'll have, like Pri's mentioned, the Climate Action Lab next week being run by Hawkwood Centre for Future Thinking, which the Network of Wellbeing will run a session as part of the programme, a networking session. Really excited about being a part of that, and then we invite you all to join our Together for the Planet networking session. So I think that is kind of the closing, a few minutes early, but the closing of our series as a whole. So what I'd love to do, if it's okay, is just take a little screenshot of everyone joining this evening, because we love to love to stay connected with you all on social media in between these types of events. So I think someone put in the chat earlier that we've got a hashtag Good Lives Earth for this series. We'd like this to be the beginning of a discussion rather than the end. So yeah, we'd love you to stay in touch on social media and come to our networking event. I will take a quick screenshot now. So if you're, thanks, nice waving if you would like to. Yeah, so lovely, lovely to connect with you all, and really hope to connect with you all in more depth at these upcoming networking events. And yeah, Tracy, would you like to say any other closing words before we finish?
So I was just busy typing in the chat to say, yes, we will send the information via email as long as you've put your GDPR, you've approved. But yes, I think I would like to thank Flo actually and Roger and because Mirella, I think, and Josh are here. There's quite a lot of work that goes into the background of these and engaging with our speakers and planning sessions, so you get the best out of it. And Molly and I love working with Flo and the Network of Wellbeing, because they practice what they preach, and we have a wonderful, happy time working together as well. And I think you'll all agree that Flo holds the space most beautifully. So I would just like to say thank you to you, Flo.
Oh, thanks so much, Tracy. That's really sweet of you. Well, thank you very much. That's a really kind words to end on. And yeah, we've been super efficient time-wise this evening. So I'd invite you, if you would like to, I'll stop the recording, and if you would like to unmute yourself and say goodbye as you're leaving, you're very welcome to. But thank you so much, everyone, for being a part of the Do Good Lives Have to Cost the Earth series. And the answer is no.
Thank you. 5 minutes to